Colonel Hargrove slammed his fist on the table and pointed at the satellite photo. "Pull them out," he said coldly. "Leave the gunship. We cannot risk more assets for 12 men who are already compromised." Nobody in that room argued. Nobody pushed back. 12 American soldiers were being written off like a budget line. That was the moment everything changed, because one person in the back of that room had been listening, and she was already standing up. Before we go any further, if this kind of story moves you, please subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The command center smelled like burnt coffee, diesel fuel, and 3 days without sleep. It was not a glamorous place. It was a converted storage room carved into the side of a forward operating base in eastern Afghanistan, somewhere in the jagged mountain terrain that ate helicopters and swallowed men whole. The walls were concrete. The ceiling was low. Somebody had taped a hand-drawn map of the valley to the far wall with duct tape, and the tape was already peeling at the corners, because the cold air in those mountains respected nothing. Not tape, not plans, and certainly not the careful strategies of military commanders who had never set foot in that valley themselves. There were folding tables arranged in a rough rectangle. There were laptops open on half of them, their screens casting pale blue light across faces that all wore the same expression, the tight jaw, flat mouth look of people who are managing information they do not want to manage. There were radios. There were coffee cups. There were piles of paper that meant something to someone earlier in the day and now meant very little, because the situation on the ground had changed so completely that almost everything written down before 9 o'clock that evening was already obsolete. At the head of the table sat Captain Nathan Cole. I was 38 years old. He had been a SEAL for 14 of those years, which meant he had spent roughly a third of his entire life in places most Americans would never be able to find on a map. He was not a large man in the movie hero sense of the word. He was medium height, lean, in the way that comes from genuine hard use rather than gym membership. And he had a quality that people who served under him always noticed, and almost never could put into words, a kind of absolute stillness in his face when things went wrong, as though the worse the situation became, the more energy he conserved. I was very still right now. In front of him was a satellite image, printed in the last hour, showing a narrow valley approximately 40 kilometers from the base. The valley had been selected 3 weeks ago as a viable extraction route for a sensitive recovery operation. 3 weeks ago, that assessment had been correct. The terrain provided natural cover. There were limited approach vectors for enemy ground forces. The valley floor was wide enough for a helicopter to land without significant risk. 3 weeks ago, however, the enemy had not yet moved 2 additional units into the surrounding ridgeline positions. That had changed 6 hours ago, and when the weather system that the meteorological team had predicted would pass north of the base had instead turned south and come directly over the mountains with winds pushing 60 miles an hour and visibility dropping to near zero. The mission that was supposed to be clean, fast, and invisible had become something else entirely. Shadow Team 9 was trapped. 12 operators, 6 SEALs, 2 Army Rangers, a combat controller, a medic, and 2 intelligence specialists were pinned inside a cluster of abandoned buildings at the northern end of the valley. They had gone in to recover a captured American asset. They had recovered him. They had done their job exactly the way they were trained to do it. And then the weather had shut the door behind them. The extraction helicopter, a modified Black Hawk that had been holding at a staging point 12 kilometers out, had been unable to penetrate the storm. The pilot, a veteran warrant officer named Dakarai, who Cole had flown with twice before and trusted without reservation, had made 3 attempts. On the 3rd attempt, a wind shear had grabbed the aircraft and pushed it toward the mountain face hard enough that Dakarai had declared an emergency and diverted to the nearest alternate field. He landed safely. Nobody was hurt. But the helicopter was grounded, the weather showed no sign of breaking, and the team in the valley had just reported that enemy scouts were moving along the western ridge. They had ammunition. They had medical supplies. The rescued asset was wounded but stable. They had maybe 30 minutes before the scouts located them. Colonel Hargrove had entered the room at 8:47 in the evening. He was the senior officer at the base, which meant he was the person who made the decision that everyone in this room was trying very hard not to make. He looked at the satellite image for approximately 90 seconds. Then he said what he said. "Pull them out. Leave the gunship. We cannot risk more assets for 12 men who are already compromised. The silence after those words was the kind of silence that has weight to it, the kind you feel in your chest. Captain Cole looked up from the table very slowly. "Sir," he said, and his voice was completely level, which everyone in the room recognized as the sound of a man choosing his words with great care. "There is an AC-130 on the flight line, fueled, armed, if we can find a qualified pilot to fly support." "The pilot is gone," Hargrove said. "Medevaced an hour ago, knee injury, and I am not authorizing a combat support mission in this weather with an unqualified crew." "Then we find a qualified crew." "Captain Cole." Hargrove turned and looked at him directly. "I understand what you are asking. I understand what is at stake. But I will not throw more lives into that valley because we cannot accept a difficult outcome." Cole held the colonel's gaze. "With respect, sir," he said quietly, "a difficult outcome is not the same as an abandoned one." Hargrove picked up his radio, said something to an aide, and walked out. The door didn't slam, it just closed, quietly, which somehow felt worse. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Cole looked around the room at the 24 people sitting at those tables, and he asked the question that nobody expected him to ask out loud. "Is there anyone in this room who can fly combat support AC-130 qualified? Right now, tonight?" He said it the way you say something when you already know the answer is probably no, but you are asking anyway because not asking is not something you are willing to do. The room was quiet. Someone coughed. Someone else shifted in their chair. A senior chief petty officer named Vasquez looked down at the table, not because he was hiding, but because the weight of not being able to help felt like something physical. Cole scanned the room slowly. Operators, intelligence staff, logistics personnel, a liaison officer from the Army, 2 contractors who handled satellite communications, a naval flight officer who had been attached to the unit for coordination purposes and whose fixed-wing currency had lapsed 18 months ago. Nobody raised a hand, nobody spoke. Cole pressed his lips together and looked back at the map. That was when he heard the sound. It was a small sound, almost nothing, the scrape of a chair leg against concrete barely audible under the hum of the radios and the distant moan of the wind pushing against the building's ventilation gaps. He looked up. In the far back corner of the room, not at any of the main tables, but in the single folding chair pressed against the far wall near the door that led to the supply corridor, a woman was standing up. She had been sitting there for most of the last 2 hours, and the honest truth was that most people in the room had not noticed her. Not because she was unremarkable in any meaningful sense, but because she had a quality of stillness about her that made her easy to overlook. She was not trying to be invisible. She simply wasn't demanding to be seen. She was wearing an Air Force uniform that had seen better days. Not slovenly, clearly maintained, clearly worn with care, but traveled. The kind of uniform that had been packed and repacked, carried through airports and cargo holds and forward bases until it had taken on the texture of something lived in rather than issued. Her hair was pulled back in a neat knot at the base of her neck. She had dark eyes and a face that was at this moment carrying the particular expression of someone who has just made a decision they know is going to complicate the next several hours of their life considerably. She walked forward. She walked the way people walk when they have made up their mind about something and are not looking for anyone's permission to have done so. Cole watched her cross the room. Around him, he was aware of people shifting, turning, the kind of quiet attention that moves through a group of people when something unexpected happens. She stopped at the table, looked at the map, looked at Cole. "Major Claire Bennett," she said, "Air Force Special Operations Command." Cole looked at her. He did not look dismissive, but he looked careful the way you look when an unexpected variable enters a situation and you need to evaluate it quickly. "What are you doing on this base, Major?" "Transit," she said. "I was waiting for a flight out. Weather held me here. AC-130 quals, current." "How current?" She didn't hesitate. "I flew one 7 weeks ago. Kandahar. Fire support mission, forward edge engagement, night conditions." Somebody at the table, Cole would find out later, it was a lieutenant named Prescott, who had never in his professional life hesitated to voice an opinion, said under his breath but not quite quietly enough. "She's a transport pilot, isn't she?" Claire did not turn to look at him. She kept her eyes on Cole. "Before transport command," she said, still addressing Cole, still holding his gaze. "I flew 8 combat deployments, AC-130 gunship. 940 hours of combined combat flight time, 41 direct fire support missions. She paused for exactly one beat. I know that aircraft, I know this kind of weather, and I know what happens to 12 people in that valley if nobody goes. Cole studied her face for a long moment. I was looking for something specific. The thing he always looked for when he was deciding whether to trust someone was something that mattered. It wasn't bravado. Bravado was easy to fake, and he'd learned long ago that the louder someone advertised their courage, the faster that courage tended to evaporate under actual pressure. He was looking for the thing underneath bravado. He was looking for the thing that stays when the noise goes away. He found it. You understand what I'm asking you to do, he said. It was not a question. Yes. The weather is... I saw the weather report. I also flew through worse than this coming over the Hindu Kush in 2019. She pointed to the map a specific ridgeline. This terrain creates a natural windbreak along the eastern approach below 4,000 feet. It won't be clean, but it's flyable. Prescott made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Cole turned and looked at him. Prescott stopped making the sound. Cole turned back to Claire. You'd be flying with a crew you've never worked with, in an aircraft you haven't pre-flight checked, into a combat environment with active enemy air defense assets. Yes, you understand that Colonel Hargrove has already declined to authorize this mission. I understand that. Which means if you do this, it falls on me, she said. I know. Cole looked at the map again, looked at the coordinates where Shadow Team 9 was holding, looked at the timeline on the screen to his left, which was updating in real time as the Intelligence Watch officer tracked enemy movement along the western ridge. 18 minutes. 18 minutes until the scouts reached the cluster of buildings where 12 people were waiting. Major Bennett, Cole said. Sir, can you get them home? The room was completely silent. Claire looked at the coordinates on the map. She looked at the weather data on the nearest screen. She looked at the flight path she had already been mentally calculating since she stood up, because she was the kind of person who did not stand up unless she had already done the calculation. Yes, she said, and that was when the real complication began. Because the crew chief of the AC-130, a staff sergeant named Holloway, who had been standing in the doorway for the last 3 minutes, listening to this entire exchange, stepped forward and said, Sir, I need to say something. Cole looked at him. Holloway was 32. He had 700 hours on AC-130 platforms. He was not the kind of person who spoke up in rooms full of officers unless he believed he had something worth saying. Sergeant, Cole said, that aircraft has a hydraulic pressure irregularity in the number 2 system, Holloway said. We flagged it this afternoon for maintenance inspection. It's not grounded, it's flyable. But in this weather, pushing hard maneuvers, it could become a problem. Cole looked at Claire. Claire looked at Holloway. How irregular, she asked. Fluctuating about 8% below nominal under sustained load. Stable at cruise. Shows up under combat maneuvering. Does it affect weapons systems? Holloway paused. No, ma'am. Fire control is independent. Does it affect flight control authority? Not yet, but under hard sustained maneuvering. I'll compensate, she said. You'll be right seat. You know that aircraft better than I do. If it starts to go wrong, I need you to tell me immediately, and I need you to trust my response. Can you do that? Holloway looked at her. There was something in the look, not challenge exactly. More like evaluation. The look of someone deciding very fast whether the person in front of them is the real thing. Yes, ma'am, he said. Cole made the decision in the next 3 seconds. Some decisions you make after long deliberation. You weigh options, you consult, you consider second and third order consequences. Some decisions you make because the alternative is to watch 12 people die and spend the rest of your life knowing you could have done something. Go, he said. Both of you, I'll handle Hargrove. Claire was already turning toward the door. Holloway was right behind her. At the table, Prescott opened his mouth. Cole looked at him. Prescott closed his mouth. The door opened, and the cold hit them immediately. The Afghan mountain cold that had no interest in courtesy, that cut through the base uniform, like it wasn't there, that came off the peaks with a kind of indifferent hostility that had been wearing down soldiers of various empires in these mountains for literally thousands of years. Claire didn't slow down. She had a specific way of walking when she was mission-focused, not hurried exactly, but purposeful, in a way that had nothing wasteful in it. No extra motion, no hesitation. Every step was pointed at the aircraft. Holloway matched her pace. Major, he said after they had covered maybe 50 meters across the flight line, the wind pushing against them from the northeast. I want to be honest with you. Please, she said. I don't know you. I didn't know you were on the base. And I just told a room full of people that I'm willing to fly with you into an active combat environment based on about 90 seconds of conversation. That's a fair concern, don't you said? Are you actually as good as you said you are? She glanced at him sideways for exactly 1 second. No, she said. Holloway blinked. I'm better than I said, she said, because what I said was the minimum. The truth is longer and would take more time than we have. Holloway was quiet for about 4 steps. Then something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but the absence of the doubt that had been there before. Okay, he said. Okay. The aircraft was sitting at the far end of the flight line. It was enormous and old and scarred in the way that working aircraft get scarred, not dramatically, not with the picturesque damage of something in a movie, but with the accumulated small evidence of hard use over many years. Patched panels, replaced components. The kind of history written in maintenance logs that told a story of an aircraft that had been asked to do difficult things regularly and had mostly risen to the occasion. The ground crew, 3 of them all in their 20s, were standing near the nose. They had been told, apparently, that something was happening because they were already beginning to remove the wheel chocks. Claire walked up the ladder without stopping. Inside the cockpit, she settled into the left seat, and her hands moved to the pre-start checklist with the automatic ease of deep familiarity. Not the self-conscious deliberateness of someone performing competence. The unconscious ease of someone who has done this so many times that the checklist lives in their muscle memory. Holloway slid into the right seat. Pre-start, she said, ready. They moved through it together, and somewhere in the middle of that checklist, Holloway felt the thing that veteran aircrew feel when they realize they are flying with someone who genuinely knows what they are doing. It's not a dramatic moment. It's actually a quiet one. It's the moment when the anxiety in your chest, the normal, healthy, appropriate anxiety that comes from flying into a combat environment doesn't go away, but it settles. It finds its proper level because you trust the person next to you, and that trust changes the weight of the fear. Engines, Claire said. She started them in sequence, listening to each one the way a surgeon listens to a heartbeat, hearing the specific quality of the sound that tells you what the instruments can't always tell you. Number 3 sounds slightly rough on start, she said. Holloway checked his instruments. You heard that. The frequency is off by maybe half a tone. It'll smooth out, but watch the temperature differential on that engine in the first 10 minutes. Holloway made a note. The radios came alive. Raven 1, said a voice from the command center, and it was Cole's voice. You are cleared for immediate departure. Shadow Team 9 is now reporting enemy scouts visual on their position. 14 minutes to engagement. 14 minutes. Claire keyed her radio. Raven 1 copies. Rolling in 2. Holloway looked at her. She was looking at the instruments. Then she glanced up through the windshield at the darkness in the storm at the mountains that were invisible behind the weather, but that both of them knew were there, enormous and indifferent and dangerous. You know what the worst part is, Holloway said. Claire throttled up. Tell me, she said. I left a good cup of coffee on the table in there. Something moved in Claire's face. Not a laugh, but the edges of one. I'll buy you a worse one when we get back, she said. The aircraft began to move. At the back of the room they had just left, Captain Cole was on the radio to the valley, trying to buy time, trying to keep 12 people focused and calm and in the buildings, because the worst thing they could do right now was break cover and move. His senior chief, Vasquez, came and stood beside him. You think she can do it? Vasquez asked quietly, not challenging, just asking. Cole watched the flight line through the small, grimy window. He watched the lights of the AC-130 moving toward the runway. She stood up, he said. Sir Toran, I asked if anyone could fly. Every trained pilot in that room either wasn't qualified or stayed in their chair. She stood up. Cole paused. People who can't do things don't stand up like that. Vasquez looked at the window. She didn't look like much, he said, not unkindly, just honestly. No, Cole said. She didn't. He pressed his radio to his ear. 14 minutes. Inside the aircraft, the runway was ahead, and beyond the runway was the darkness where the mountains lived and where 12 people were listening to enemy boots getting closer in the night. Claire pushed the throttles forward. The aircraft began to accelerate. The storm was directly ahead. Yes, you know, she had flown into worse. She remembered it clearly, the flight in 2019, the one she had mentioned to Cole in the briefing room. She had not mentioned that 2 of her crew members had been injured in that flight when an unexpected updraft had slammed the aircraft hard enough to throw people against the ceiling. She had not mentioned that she had flown the last 40 minutes of that mission with a bleeding cut above her left eye from where her own head had connected with the instrument panel. She had not mentioned any of that because none of it was relevant to the question Cole had asked her. Cole had asked her if she could get them home. She had said yes. That was the whole of it. The wheels lifted off the runway and the aircraft entered the storm, and for the next 30 seconds, everything in the cockpit shook with a violence that would have alarmed a less experienced crew. Claire held the aircraft steady. Her hands were completely calm. Holloway watched her hands. He looked at the instruments. He looked at her hands again. "You weren't kidding," he said. "I never kid about aircraft," she said. The aircraft climbed into the darkness. Below them, somewhere in the broken maze of those ancient mountains, 12 people were waiting. Above them, the storm had opinions about whether anyone was going to reach those 12 people tonight. Claire had opinions too, and she had been flying a lot longer than the storm. The radio crackled. "Raven 1, this is Shadow 9 Actual." The voice was careful and controlled, but there was something underneath it, the specific kind of compressed urgency that soldiers use when they are trying to communicate how bad things are without sounding like they are asking to be rescued. "Be advised, we have confirmed visual on enemy element. Approximately 20 personnel moving along the north tree line toward our position. We have the package. We are ready to move on your signal." Cole's voice came on a second later from the command center. "Shadow 9, hold position. Raven 1 is inbound, ETA." He paused and Claire could hear him doing the math. 8 minutes, 8 minutes. In the cockpit, Claire was navigating through the storm using terrain awareness systems and her own knowledge of these mountain systems, feeling her way through the darkness with instruments and instinct in roughly equal measure. She had found the approach corridor she had mentioned to Cole, the natural windbreak created by the ridgeline configuration on the eastern side of the valley, and it was in fact doing more or less what she had told him it would do. The turbulence inside that corridor was significant but manageable. The crosswind component was less than she had feared. She was going to make it in 8 minutes, possibly 7 if the last 5 kilometers cooperated. "Weapon systems are hot," Holloway reported. "Copy. Fire control is nominal." "Copy. Hydraulic pressure on System 2, Holloway paused. "Say it," Claire said. "Down to 11% below nominal, under current load." Claire did not change her expression. "Okay," she said. "Watch it. Tell me if it drops another 5. It drops another 5, we need to talk about." "I know. Tell me anyway. I want to know when it happens, not after." "Yes, ma'am." The mountains were around them now, invisible in the storm, but present in the way that things you can't see are sometimes more present than things you can. The terrain awareness system was painting them in yellow and orange on the display elevation data translated into color, the aircraft threading through the gaps between the peaks at low altitude in a way that would have seemed reckless to someone who had not done it before. Claire had done it before. She had done it in these specific mountains, in this specific aircraft type, in conditions that were in some respects worse than tonight. She did not feel calm. She felt precise. There is a difference. Calm is an absence of feeling. Precision is a way of directing feeling, taking the fear and the focus and the adrenaline and the physical response to the darkness and the shaking aircraft and the sound of the wind and converting all of it into exactly the right amount of pressure on the controls at exactly the right moment. She had learned that difference 8 years ago on a night that she did not often think about and never talked about. The night she had lost 2 members of her crew. Not from pilot error, not from anything she could have prevented. An enemy missile that came out of the dark before anyone had any warning, and the aircraft had survived barely, and she had brought it home, but 2 of her people had not come home with it. She had spent a long time afterward in the particular silence that comes from surviving something others did not. She had spent a long time wondering what her survival meant, if it meant anything at all. Eventually, she had decided that it meant she still had work to do. That was still true tonight. 6 minutes, Holloway said. "Shadow 9 Raven, 1, be advised, we are 6 minutes out. Claire's voice on the radio was steady and clear. Maintain position. On my mark, mark your location with IR strobe. Copy Raven 1, standing by. Another voice, then different, slightly higher in pitch. The controlled but not entirely controlled voice of someone who had been holding it together for a while and was aware that the clock was running. Raven 1, this is Sergeant Kirby, Shadow 9. Enemy element is now inside 200 meters. They know where we are. Please advise. 200 meters. Shadow 9, Sergeant Kirby, Claire said. I advise you to stay in those buildings for 5 more minutes. I'll handle the 200 meters. A very brief silence. Then Kirby's voice, and something had changed in it. Something had shifted. Some weight had been rearranged. Copy that, Raven 1, holding position. Waiting on you. Holloway looked at her. You said that like it was easy, he said. I know, she said. That's the point. She did not mean it was actually easy. She meant that the people in those buildings needed to hear easy right now. They needed to hear that the person coming for them was not worried. Even if the person coming for them was in fact worried in several distinct and legitimate ways. You carry the fear for them, she was thinking. That's part of the job. You carry it so they don't have to. The valley was ahead. She could see it on the terrain display, the narrow corridor between the ridges. The flat floor where the buildings were the dark shapes that the intelligence overlay was painting as enemy movement along the north tree line. Weapons ready, she said. Weapons ready, Holloway confirmed. Shadow 9 Raven 1 is on station. Mark your position. Below the aircraft in the darkness and the storm, a tiny infrared light blinked on. She found it in the targeting system. She found the enemy element. She made the calculation she had been making since she stood up in that command center. The distances, the angles, the safety margins that kept the people she was protecting safe from the weapons she was firing. Fire control locked, she said. Confirmed, Holloway said. Shadow 9 Raven 1, keep your heads down. And then the aircraft that nobody believed would fly tonight, piloted by the woman nobody had noticed sitting in the corner, brought its terrible weight to bear on the enemy that had been closing in on 12 Americans in a narrow mountain valley in the dark. The radio from the valley went quiet. Then after a long moment, a voice came back. It was different from before. Raven 1, said the voice of Sergeant Kirby. Whoever you are, he stopped. There was something in the pause. Thank you. Claire held the aircraft steady in the storm. She was not done. She would not be done until every one of those 12 people was out of that valley. But she allowed herself for exactly 1 second to feel the weight of what had just happened. 12 people were still alive. The mission was not over. But 12 people were still alive. She looked at the valley below at the IR strobe, still blinking at the terrain display at the instruments, at the hydraulic pressure warning that was now sitting at 13% below nominal and would need to be watched very carefully. She looked at all of it, then she looked at Holloway. Let's bring them home, she said. And Holloway, who had spent the last 7 minutes watching the woman beside him do things with an aircraft in mountainous combat conditions that he would spend the rest of his life trying to accurately describe, simply nodded. Yes, ma'am, he said. Let's bring them home. The first pass worked. That was the fact that mattered most in the 30 seconds after the weapons run ended, when the radios went quiet and everyone in the cockpit in the command center, in the cluster of broken buildings on the valley floor, held their breath, waiting to understand what had just happened. The enemy element that had been inside 200 meters of Shadow Team 9's position had pulled back. Not destroyed, not neutralized completely, but disrupted enough, shaken enough that the immediate pressure on the team had broken. 12 people were still in those buildings. 12 people were still breathing. Claire did not celebrate. She did not exhale with relief. She was already running the next calculation because the first pass had answered one question and immediately created 3 more. And in her experience, that was precisely how combat aviation worked. You solved the problem in front of you, and the solving immediately revealed the next problem that had been hiding behind it. The first new problem was the hydraulic pressure on System 2, which Holloway reported at 14% below nominal, now climbing steadily in the wrong direction under the load of the combat maneuvering she had just put the aircraft through. The second new problem was the weather, which had not improved while she was busy, and which had in the last 8 minutes shifted its principal energy from the northeast to almost due north, meaning the windbreak corridor she had used on the inbound leg was degrading. Coming back through it on an outbound track with a damaged hydraulic system would be a different calculation than the one she had made 40 minutes ago. The third new problem was the one that Sergeant Kirby told her about at T plus 90 seconds after the first pass, and it was the one she had been hoping not to hear. Raven 1 Shadow 9. Kirby's voice was controlled. He was working very hard to keep it controlled. We have a KIA, Sergeant First Class Torres. He was wounded before you arrived. The medic he didn't make it. A breath. We also have 2 additional wounded from the initial contact. 1 ambulatory, 1 is not. The non-ambulatory casualty is our package, the asset we came to recover. Claire processed this in the time it took her to complete a turn and bring the aircraft back over the valley. 1 dead, 2 more wounded, and the entire mission had been built around recovering the asset. The reason 12 operators had gone into that valley in the first place was now non-ambulatory, which meant he couldn't walk out, couldn't run, couldn't move under his own power, which meant any ground extraction was going to take longer, which meant the team was going to die exposed for longer, which meant the 30-minute window that Colonel Hargrove had calculated when he walked out of the command center was no longer 30 minutes. It was whatever she could make it. Copy Shadow 9, she said. I'm sorry about Torres. She said it because it was true, and because she believed that true things deserved to be said, even when you were in the middle of a combat mission and every second had a cost. Give me your current enemy situation. Enemy has pulled back approximately 400 meters to the north tree line. They are regrouping. We estimate they're calling for additional assets. We intercepted a radio transmission in the last 2 minutes. They're requesting indirect fire support. Kirby paused. Mortars, Raven 1. They're calling in mortars. Holloway heard this at the same time Claire did. He looked at her. She was already adjusting the aircraft's orbit pattern, widening it, changing the geometry to give herself better coverage of the northern approach. How long before those mortars are effective, she asked. Intel is estimating 12 to 15 minutes before they have a firing solution. Cole's voice came over the command net immediately after. He had been listening to every word. Raven 1, this is Cole. I'm working the extraction. There is a secondary HLZ helicopter landing zone approximately 2 kilometers south of your current team position. It is outside the current enemy direct fire envelope. If I can get extraction aircraft repositioned to that location, can you provide cover for the team movement? Claire looked at the terrain display. Found the secondary landing zone, ran the numbers. 2 kilometers on foot, non-ambulatory casualty. Probably 4 to 6 people needed to carry him, which meant those 4 to 6 people had their hands occupied and could not effectively fight while moving. The team was already carrying 1 KIA Torres because you did not leave your people behind, which was not a rule written in a manual, but a rule written in something deeper. The kind of rule that doesn't require enforcement because the people who follow it cannot imagine not following it. Cold law, she said. That's doable on my end, but your team is going to be moving in the open for somewhere between 8 and 12 minutes depending on terrain and casualty condition, in that 12 to 15-minute mortar window. The math is uncomfortable. I know the math, Cole said. Give me 3 minutes. You have 3 minutes, Claire said. And then because she had just reminded herself that every second had a cost, and 3 minutes was a long time in a combat environment with a deteriorating hydraulic system and an enemy that was currently reorganizing. She added, and then I'm going to need a decision. Cole clicked off. Holloway took the moment of relative quiet to update her on the hydraulic system. 16% below nominal, he said. It's not accelerating, but it's not stabilizing either. If it hits 25, we lose precision steering authority on the ground, Claire said. It was not a question. She already knew. Somewhere in that range, yes. And in the air, we lose some responsiveness in tight maneuvering. Nothing catastrophic, but in this weather, in this terrain, it becomes more of a factor. Yes, ma'am. She adjusted her grip on the controls. In the command center, 40 kilometers away. Captain Cole was doing 3 things simultaneously. He was on the radio to the forward air controller at the secondary landing zone, trying to confirm that the site was clear of obstacles and accessible in the current weather. He was on a separate channel to the Medevac Coordination Center, trying to get the extraction helicopter repositioned from its alternate field to the secondary LZ. And he was doing the math, the same uncomfortable math Claire had identified on the timeline. Vasquez stood next to him. Mortars change everything, Vasquez said quietly. I know. If those tubes are set up in the northern tree line, they can range both the current team position and the movement corridor to the secondary LZ. I know, Senior Chief. And if they get around in the air while the team is moving, I know. Cole said it flatly, not harshly, but with the finality of someone who was fully aware of what he knew and didn't need it repeated. He looked at Vasquez. What's the call? Vasquez was quiet for a moment. He was 61 years old. He had been a SEAL for 33 years. He had been in more bad situations than he could accurately count, and he had developed over those 3 decades a very specific kind of judgment about when a situation was recoverable and when it was not. He said, the call is that we have an aircraft up there and a pilot who is still flying it, and that aircraft is the only thing standing between our people and those mortars. The question isn't whether to move. The question is how fast we can move and whether she can cover us long enough to do it. Cole was already back on the radio. Raven 1 Cole. Go, said Claire. Extraction aircraft is repositioning now. ETA to secondary LZ is 11 minutes. I need the team to start moving in 2 minutes. Can you cover a 12-minute movement window? 12 minutes. Claire looked at the hydraulic pressure reading. She looked at the weather data on the northern approach. She looked at the terrain display, at the probable mortar positions in the tree line, at the movement corridor the team would have to use. She looked at Holloway. Holloway looked back at her. I didn't say anything. He just looked at her with an expression that said accurately, I will back whatever you decide. Yes, Claire told Cole. Move them. In the valley, Sergeant Kirby got the word from Cole and turned to his team. There were 11 of them now. Torres was wrapped in a thermal blanket ready to be carried. The rescued asset, a man named Brennan, a State Department intelligence officer, who had been in enemy custody for 6 weeks and who was now dealing with the combined effects of captivity injuries and a gunshot wound to the left thigh, was on a field expedient stretcher made from rifle slings and 2 tent poles that someone had found in the buildings. Kirby looked at his team. They looked back at him. He had worked with most of these people long enough that he didn't need to give a speech. They knew what was ahead. They knew the timeline. They knew that the aircraft above them was the only thing that had kept them alive in the last 20 minutes, and that they were going to be moving through open ground with that aircraft as their only protection for the next 12 minutes. What he said was this: Torres goes home. Brennan goes home. All of us go home. Stay tight, stay low, and trust Raven 1. Move. They moved. In the cockpit of the AC-130, Claire saw the IR strobes begin to shift the team's movement beacons, translating on her display as a cluster of lights moving slowly south across the valley floor. Slowly because of the stretcher. Slowly because of the weight they were carrying. Slowly because they were 11 people moving through mountainous terrain in the dark in a storm while trying to fight if they had to fight. She widened her coverage orbit. She was watching the northern tree line. The mortar threat was specific, not theoretical. The enemy had the range. They had the equipment. The question was whether they had enough cover, enough positioning confidence to set up a tube and fire accurately before the team reached the secondary LZ. She kept her eyes on the tree line. At T+4 minutes into the team's movement, Holloway said, "We've got a heat signature at the tree line, northern edge, approximately 300 meters west of the primary enemy position from earlier." She had seen it the same second he said it. Size small. Consistent with a 2-man mortar team setting up. 2-man team, mortar, setting up. Setting up meant they didn't have a firing solution yet. Setting up meant there was a window. Shadow 9, Raven 1. Claire's voice on the radio was the same voice she always used, level, clear, containing nothing that didn't need to be there. "We have a potential mortar team at your north tree line grid," she read off the coordinates from her display. "We're going to address it. Keep moving." Kirby's voice came back in 3 words. Copy, moving. She brought the aircraft around. This was the moment that a certain type of person would have hesitated, because engaging a mortar position with the team in motion meant taking her primary weapons coverage away from the movement corridor for the time it took to service the target, and that window of reduced coverage was a risk, and the risk had a name. Specifically, it had 11 names and 1 more name wrapped in a thermal blanket. Claire did not hesitate. She engaged the mortar position. The result was definitive. There was no longer a mortar team at the northern tree line. Holloway had been watching the hydraulic pressure during the engagement. 18% below nominal, he said when it was done. "Okay," she said. "We're getting closer to that threshold." "I know." She was already repositioning over the movement corridor. Talk to me about the systems that matter right now. Weapons control is fine, navigation is fine, engines are all nominal. The hydraulic issue is affecting secondary systems gear flaps on landing, precision, ground maneuvering. In the air in this flight regime, you're going to notice it mostly in the heavy maneuvering response. You'll ask for something and the aircraft will give it to you about a half second late and at maybe 80% of the authority you'd expect. So I asked earlier and I asked for more. That's one way to manage it. That's the way we're managing it, she said. 7 minutes into the team's movement, something happened that Claire had not specifically predicted, but that she recognized immediately as the kind of thing that combat environments produce regularly and without apology. A voice came over the radio on a different frequency. Not the command net, not the team frequency. A guard frequency. The frequency that military aircraft broadcast on universally, the frequency that meant something is happening, that everyone in the air needs to know about right now. The voice was speaking in a language that was not English in Holloway, who had spent 2 tours in this specific theater and who had picked up enough of the local dialect to function when absolutely rigid in his seat. What is it? Claire said. Holloway was listening. His face was doing something that it had not done at any point in the last 40 minutes. Something that was not exactly fear, but was very close to the neighbor of fear, the thing that lives next door to it. They have another team, he said, a ground unit that wasn't in our intelligence picture. Coming from the east, they're further out, probably 10-12 minutes, but they're on a line that intercepts the secondary LZ. He said it very calmly. Claire did not change her expression. She was thinking about the 11 people on the valley floor who had 8 minutes to walk, and about the extraction helicopter that was 11 minutes out, and about the hydraulic system that was degrading, and about the weather that was not improving, and about the ground unit from the east that was 10 minutes away from a position that overlapped with the place where all of these timelines converged. And then she thought about something else. She thought about Cole in that command center 40 kilometers away, who was managing this same information, and who needed to know all of it right now because he was the operational commander and it was his call to make. Cole, she said on the command net, go. New element, ground unit approaching from the east outside our current intelligence picture. My estimate is 10 to 12 minutes to the secondary LZ area. What's the status of extraction aircraft? Cole's voice came back in 3 seconds. 9 minutes out. The math was what the math was. 9 minutes for the extraction aircraft. 10 to 12 minutes for the enemy ground unit, a window, a very specific, very tight, very unforgiving window. Cole said, Raven 1, can you intercept the eastern element? And this was the moment, the real moment, the one that everything else had been building toward, in ways that neither Claire nor Cole nor anyone else had understood when the night began, because the question Cole was asking was not a simple tactical question. It was a question about physics, about what one aircraft with a degrading hydraulic system and limited fuel state, and a weapons load that had already been partially expended, could physically do while simultaneously covering a team in movement toward an LZ that was 9 minutes away from its extraction aircraft. You couldn't be in 2 places at once. That was the fundamental problem. You could be in one place, then you could move to another place. And the time it took to move was the time that the team was uncovered. And the time that the team was uncovered was the time that the eastern ground unit was closing. Claire did not answer immediately. She ran the geometry. She looked at the display. She looked at the team's movement beacons. She looked at the projected intercept point for the eastern ground unit. She looked at the hydraulic pressure reading, 19% below nominal, and she saw something. It was not a miracle. It was not a revelation. It was the kind of thing that 940 hours of combat flight time produces in a person, the ability to look at a problem that appears to have no solution and find the specific angle from which the problem has a different shape than it appeared to have from the front. The eastern ground unit was coming through a narrow defile, a gap between 2 ridge features approximately 6 kilometers east of the secondary LZ. They had to come through that defile because the terrain on either side of it was impassable. That defile was the only path, and the defile was reachable. Not easily, not safely exactly, but reachable if she was willing to push the aircraft hard in the next 4 minutes, engage the defile, and get back over the LZ before the team arrived. If the hydraulic system held. if the weather in the D-file didn't close down faster than her current data suggested it would. If she was reading the terrain display correctly and the default was what she thought it was. Three significant ifs. Three significant ifs was three too many normally. But normally was not a concept that applied to tonight. Cold, she said. I have an option. It requires me to be off the team for 4 minutes. I need the team to stop and hold in place during that window. Can they do that? Wait one, Cole said. She could hear him on a side channel talking to Kirby. Kirby's response came back in 20 seconds. Raven 1, Shadow 9, we can hold. But we found cover only for 8 people. 3 of us are going to be in the open. 3 people exposed in an open field for 4 minutes. 3 people she was about to leave without air cover. She thought about that for exactly as long as she needed to think about it. Shadow 9, she said, put your 3 best shooters in the open. Make sure they can see north and south. And tell them that 4 minutes from right now I will be back overhead. A pause. Kirby said 4 minutes. 4 minutes, she confirmed. She pushed the throttles forward. The aircraft accelerated into the northern darkness, and for the next 4 minutes, Shadow Team 9 held their position on the valley floor with 3 operators in the open air and the sky above them. Empty and the eastern ridge growing slightly brighter on the horizon as the unseen ground unit moved through the D-file 6 kilometers away. In the cockpit, Holloway was watching the hydraulic pressure, the way you watch a fever gauge on someone you love, constantly hoping the number will move in the direction you need it to move. It was holding at 19. The dial appeared on the targeting display. Claire saw the movement in it, the heat signatures of personnel, moving in single file through the narrow gap, the geometric precision of a military unit, moving with purpose, the pattern of people who knew where they were going and were moving fast to get there. She made the calculation she had made twice already tonight, the one about distances and angles and safety margins, and then she did what she had come out here to do. When it was over, the defile was no longer passable. It was not a statement. It was not a demonstration. It was math. She turned the aircraft back toward the secondary LZ. Shadow 9 Raven 1 is back, she said. On your mark. Kirby's voice and something in it had changed. Something had shifted in the quality of the control he was maintaining, like a person who had been holding a very heavy object for a very long time and had just been offered help came back immediately. We see you, Raven 1. We see you. Extraction aircraft, she said to Cole. 6 minutes out, Cole said. Team movement should put them on the LZ in approximately 5, Kirby said. We're moving faster now. 5 minutes. 6 minutes. The window existed. It was not comfortable and it was not clean, but it existed, and Claire was going to fill every second of it with everything she had. Holloway, she said. Hydraulic is at 21% below nominal, he said without being asked, because he knew that was what she needed to know. Does it affect weapons? No. Does it affect my ability to maintain this orbit pattern? Holloway was quiet for 1 second, which was the length of time it took him to consider the answer seriously. At the current rate of degradation, no. Not for the next 6 minutes. After that, the maneuvering response issue becomes more pronounced. And when we go to land, one problem at a time, she said. Yes, ma'am. The team reached the secondary LZ at T+9 minutes from the moment they had started moving. The extraction helicopter came over the southern ridge at T+10. Claire saw both of these things on her display at the same time, and the particular quality of what she felt in that moment was not triumph. It was not relief exactly. It was the specific sensation of mathematics resolving the feeling of a problem that was hard and dangerous and not guaranteed to work out, actually working out, and the working out of it being inseparable from the specific choices that had led to it. The helicopter came down. The team loaded. Torres went first. Always. Then Brennan carefully, 2 people managing the stretcher, while 2 others maintained security. Then the rest of the team in the fast-practiced, organized movement of people who have trained for this specific action until it lives in their bodies. It took 4 minutes and 20 seconds from touchdown to liftoff. Claire covered every one of them. When the extraction helicopter lifted off and turned south, Kirby's voice came over the radio one last time. Shadow 9 is out. All personnel accounted for. Raven 1, he stopped. He stopped for long enough that Holloway looked at the radio and then at Claire. Then Kirby said, we've got Torres, we've got Brennan, we've got everybody. Because of you. Claire held the aircraft in its orbit for another 10 seconds, watching the helicopter's lights move south, watching the LZ clear, watching the valley below become empty of friendly movement. Then she said, "Go home, Shadow 9." She turned the aircraft north, back toward the base, back toward the runway, back toward the problem that she had been keeping in her peripheral vision for the last 40 minutes, the hydraulic system that was now at 23% below nominal. The storm that was between her and home, the landing that was going to require her to manage a compromised aircraft through instrument conditions with degraded systems. Holloway was already working through the landing checklist modifications. "Gears should extend normally," he said. "Flaps are going to be reduced authority. I'd plan for a higher approach speed and a longer roll. And precision steering on the ground is going to be, tell me what I need to know when I need to know it," she said. "Not before." "Yes, ma'am." She pushed the throttles up and pointed the nose at the storm. Back in the command center, Cole was at the window. He had watched the extraction helicopter's transponder track south, watched it leave the combat zone, watched it carry 11 living people and one fallen soldier away from the valley. He was holding a cold cup of coffee he had poured 45 minutes ago and never drunk. Vasquez came and stood next to him. "She did it," Vasquez said. Cole didn't say anything for a moment. "I was thinking about the moment in the command center when he had asked if anyone could fly, and the room had been silent, and from the corner, a chair had scraped against the floor. He was thinking about what that meant. Not just tonight, not just for this mission. I was thinking about the fact that the person who had saved 11 lives had been sitting in the corner of the room for 2 hours before anyone spoke to her, and that if the weather had broken an hour earlier, she would have gotten on her transport flight, and no one in that room would ever have known her name. He was thinking about how many other corners she had sat in, how many other rooms she had existed in without anyone thinking to ask. "Get me the status of Raven 1, he said to the watch officer. The watch officer turned to his screen. "She's inbound, sir. Approximately 22 minutes to the field." A pause. "There's a note here from the crew hydraulic system 2 is degraded. They're requesting emergency vehicles standing by on landing." Cole set down the coffee cup. "Get them, Bond," he said. The watch officer made the call. And in the aircraft, Claire was flying through the storm with a broken system and a crew chief who trusted her, and a landing ahead that was going to require everything she had left. And the only thought in her mind that was not strictly operational was the one she always came back to on the inbound leg of a combat mission. The thought was simple. She thought about the 2 crew members she had lost 8 years ago. She thought about their names, which she said silently every time, because she believed that the names of people mattered, and that saying them was a way of carrying them forward, a way of insisting on their reality against the indifference of time. She said their names, then as she said, "Let's go home." She said it to Holloway. She said it to the aircraft. She said it to herself. And the aircraft, old and scarred and carrying 23% hydraulic pressure loss and the memory of every mission it had ever flown, pointed its nose toward the base and flew. The storm did not care what she had just done. That was the thing about weather. It had no memory, no awareness, no capacity to recognize that the person flying through it had just saved 11 lives and was perhaps owed some small courtesy in return. The storm was the storm. It pushed against the aircraft with the same indifferent force it had pushed with an hour ago. And the mountains beneath it were the same mountains, and the darkness was the same darkness. And the only thing that had changed was the aircraft itself, which was now carrying a hydraulic system that was 23% below nominal and trending slowly but unmistakably in the wrong direction. 22 minutes to the field. Claire said it to herself, the way you say a number when you are trying to make it real, not as a reassurance exactly, but as a frame. 22 minutes was a specific manageable unit of time. It had edges. It had an end. She had flown through worse conditions than this in better aircraft, and she had flown through conditions like this in worse aircraft, and the specific combination in front of her right now was within the range of things she could handle. Probably. The word probably was doing a lot of work in that sentence, and she knew it. Hydraulic pressure, she said. 24, Holloway said. 1% worse since the last check. The rate of degradation was slow enough that 22 minutes was survivable. But slow was not stopped, and stopped was what she needed it to be. "Is it linear?" she asked. "The rate of loss." Holloway was studying his instruments. He took a moment before he answered, which she appreciated because a moment meant he was looking at actual data rather than giving her a number to make her feel better. Roughly, he said, maybe slightly accelerating. Hard to say with certainty. If I had to model it, I'd say we hit the field somewhere in the 26 to 28% range. 26 to 28% below nominal on landing. She ran that through what she knew about this specific aircraft's hydraulic architecture. Landing gear extension was gravity-assisted as a backup that was fine. Flap authority would be significantly reduced. She had already planned for a higher approach speed and a longer roll. Ground steering was the real concern. With that level of hydraulic loss, she would have reduced nose-wheel steering authority on rollout, which in normal conditions was manageable, but in crosswind conditions on a wet runway in the middle of a storm was a different conversation. She looked at Holloway. What's the crosswind component at the field right now? Holloway pulled up the weather data. He was quiet for 2 seconds. 15 knots, he said, gusting to 22. That was not a comfortable number. She had landed in crosswind conditions before. She had landed in crosswind conditions with degraded systems before. She had on one memorable occasion in 2018 landed a C-130 variant with a partially failed steering system in a 20-knot crosswind at a field in northern Syria that had a runway of questionable surface quality and no emergency services of any kind. She had been less tired then. She had also been less certain that things were going to be okay. Tonight she was more tired and more uncertain, and those two things in combination were the specific cocktail that she had learned over 14 years to treat with the most respect. Holloway, she said, "Ma'am, when we get back after the landing, I need you to do something for me." He looked at her. "Oh, if I make a mistake tonight, any mistake, anything that goes wrong, that shouldn't have gone wrong, I need you to be straight with me about it. I need to know, not in the debrief, right then. You understand?" Holloway held her gaze for a moment. "I haven't seen a mistake yet," he said. "The night isn't over." "No," he agreed, "but I haven't seen one yet, and I'll tell you if I do." She nodded. She focused back on the instruments. At 17 minutes to the field, the command center came back on the radio, and it was not Cole's voice this time. It was someone she didn't recognize, a different tone, a different rhythm, the clipped formality of someone reading from a script or following a protocol. "Raven 1, this is base operations. Be advised, Colonel Hargrove has requested an immediate communications check. Please authenticate on frequency Bravo 7. Claire looked at the radio panel. Holloway looked at the radio panel. They looked at each other. Bravo 7 was not a tactical frequency, it was an administrative frequency. It was the frequency you used when you wanted to have a conversation that was about command authority rather than about what was happening on the ground. "Base operations Raven 1, she said. "I am currently managing a degraded aircraft in instrument meteorological conditions on inbound approach. I am available for administrative communications after I am on the ground." "Then Raven 1, Colonel Hargrove is requesting, after I am on the ground," she said again, and her voice was the same voice she had used all night, level clear, containing nothing that didn't need to be there, and she clicked off the frequency. Holloway let out a breath that was not quite a laugh. "He's going to have opinions about this evening," Holloway said. "He had opinions about this evening before it started," Claire said. "That's what caused this evening." There was a beat. Holloway said, "That's probably the truest thing anyone has said tonight." "Concentrate on the hydraulics," she said. 24 and a half, he said. Holding roughly. Holding roughly was better than accelerating. She was going to take holding roughly. 15 minutes to the field, the second twist of the night arrived. It came as the worst twists always do, in the form of something small, something almost administrative. A voice on the radio, the command net, Cole's watch officer, with a piece of information that was delivered in the careful, neutralized tone that military personnel use when the information they are delivering is anything but neutral. "Raven 1, be advised. Weather at the field has deteriorated in the last 10 minutes. Current conditions ceiling at 400 feet, visibility 1/2 mile and heavy rain, crosswind 17 knots gusting to 24. Instrument approach is active. Emergency equipment is standing by on the runway. 400-foot ceiling, 1/2 mile visibility, crosswind gusting to 24, and a hydraulic system that was going to be at 27% below nominal by the time she arrived." Holloway did not say anything. He did not need to say anything. The number said everything. This was the landing that people wrote accident reports about. This was the landing that investigation boards reconstructed from black box data and crew testimony and runway skid marks. This was the landing that, if it went wrong, it would be described in the following morning's briefings with the specific, careful language that military institutions use when something has gone wrong that involves a loss of personnel and equipment. She knew all of that. She held the aircraft steady in the turbulence, and she thought for approximately 4 seconds about the other option. The other option was to divert. There was an alternate airfield approximately 60 kilometers west that had better weather and a longer runway, and nothing wrong with it except that it was 60 kilometers west, and she was already 20% through her fuel reserve, and the hydraulic degradation rate on a longer flight to the alternate was a variable she didn't love. She ran the numbers on the alternate. The numbers on the alternate were not better. They were different, but different is not always the same as better. And in this case, she weighed the specific risks of the alternate against the specific risks of the primary field. And she made the calculation that the primary field, with its shorter runway and worse weather and standing emergency crews, was the call. "We're going to the primary," she told Holloway. Holloway nodded once. "Copy. Walk me through the modified approach procedure." And they did it, the two of them, in the shaking aircraft in the middle of the storm, walking through the instrument approach procedure with the specific modifications required by the hydraulic situation. Higher approach speed to maintain control authority with reduced flap effectiveness. Earlier flare initiation to compensate for the delayed response time. Aggressive use of the thrust reversers on rollout to reduce the reliance on the compromised brake steering system. Emergency crews standing by in case the rollout exceeded the runway length. It was a complete professional detailed discussion of a very dangerous landing. At the end of it, Holloway said, "Any questions?" And Claire said no. And then neither of them said anything for a while. 12 minutes to the field, in the command center. Cole was standing at the window again, but there was nothing to see through it now, except the rain driving against the glass and the blurred shapes of the flight line lights in the murk. The watch officer had just given him the weather update and the information about the hydraulic system, and Cole was doing what he had done every time tonight when the situation shifted from bad to worse. He was holding very still, and he was thinking. Vasquez came and stood next to him again. It was becoming a pattern. "She's going to try to bring it in here," Cole said. It was not a question. "That's what the radio traffic suggests, yes." "Winds are gusting to 24. Yes." "With a degraded hydraulic system." "Yes." Cole turned and looked at Vasquez directly. Vasquez met his gaze. "She got our people out," Cole said. She did. Every one of them. Every one." Cole pressed his lips together. The thing he was feeling right now was not something he could name cleanly, because it was made of too many things at once: gratitude and fear and the specific helplessness of being in a command center 40 minutes ago when the lives of 12 people depended on an aircraft he couldn't fly, and a woman he'd met 20 minutes before that in a storm that didn't care about any of it. "Get Hargrove off that radio," Cole said quietly. "I don't care how. Whatever administrative nonsense he's trying to route through base operations right now, shut it down. She is flying an instrument approach in a degraded aircraft, and I don't want her distracted by anything that isn't the field." The watch officer, who had been pretending very hard not to hear this conversation, turned to his radio. Vasquez said, "Hargrove is going to—" "I'll deal with Hargrove," Cole said, "after she's on the ground." 10 minutes to the field. Inside the aircraft, Claire was flying the approach. The instruments were her world now. The artificial horizon, the altimeter, the airspeed, the localizer needle, that told her she was on the correct lateral path to the runway, the glide slope needle that told her she was on the correct vertical path. These instruments were her reference points in a world that had no visible references, where the darkness and the rain and the cloud had removed every external cue and left only the information the aircraft systems could provide. She trusted the instruments. She trusted them the way she trusted the checklist, not blindly, but with the specific calibrated confidence of someone who has used these tools under pressure enough times to know exactly what they can and cannot tell her. 8 minutes, Holloway said. Hydraulic at 25.5. Landing gear, she said. Gear down. He moved the handle. A pause. 3 green. Gear is down and locked. Flaps. Setting approach flap. You're going to feel the reduced authority response is about 60% of nominal. She felt it. It was like pushing on a door and having it respond with less than the force you put in the system, absorbing some of your input before translating it into aircraft movement. She adjusted. That was the thing about flying with degraded systems. You didn't fight them, and you didn't pretend they weren't there. You acknowledged what you had, you understood what it meant, and you flew what you actually had instead of what you wished you had. She had learned that lesson from an instructor at Hurlburt Field 18 years ago, a lieutenant colonel named Marco who had survived 2 complete engine failures and 1 hydraulic system fire in his career, and who had a philosophy about degraded aircraft that he stated simply and often. An aircraft with a problem is still an aircraft, Marco used to say. The problem is just another instrument. It's telling you something. Listen to it. She was listening. She heard the reduced flap authority in her control inputs. She heard the slightly sluggish lateral response in the crosswind correction she was making. She heard the aircraft telling her clearly and honestly exactly what it could and couldn't give her tonight, and she was flying accordingly. 6 minutes, Holloway said, crossing the initial approach fix. The field was ahead and visible in the murk, but precisely located on every navigation system she had. The runway was 47 meters wide and 3,000 meters long, which was longer than she needed in normal conditions and would be adequate tonight if she controlled the energy correctly on rollout. She ran the energy calculation again. Higher approach speed plus reduced braking authority plus crosswind equals longer stopping distance. Longer stopping distance minus runway length available equals margin. The margin existed. It was not comfortable, but it existed. 4 minutes, Holloway said. Base operations Raven 1. She checked in on the tower frequency. A voice came back immediately alert, professional and carrying the specific focus quality of someone who had been watching this approach on radar for the last 10 minutes and understood exactly what was at stake. Raven 1 base operations. You are radar identified 12 kilometers north. Winds are 170 at 16 gusting to 23. Altimeter 294. Emergency equipment is standing by. Runway is yours. Copy, she said. Raven 1 is 3 miles geared down, configured for landing. Raven 1, you are cleared to land. 3 minutes. The altimeter was unwinding. She was descending through the cloud base, and the world below the cloud was the same dark, rainy world. It had been everywhere else tonight, except that now, at 400 feet above the field, she began to see shapes. The runway lights emerging from the murk ahead of her, appearing the way runway lights always appear in instrument conditions, first as a smeared glow of color, then as specific lights, then as the precise geometry of a runway threshold. Runway in sight, she said. Runway in sight, Holloway confirmed. 2 minutes. She was on speed, on glide path, on center line. The crosswind was pushing from the left, a steady 15 knots with gusts to 23, and she was correcting for it with a combination of bank and rudder that kept the nose pointed slightly into the wind while the aircraft tracked down the center line. It was a standard crosswind correction technique, with a degraded hydraulic system at 26% below nominal. At night, in heavy rain, with a 400-foot ceiling, 100 feet, Holloway called, she reduced the bank slightly, beginning the decrab maneuver that would straighten the aircraft to align with the runway before touchdown. The hydraulic system responded at 70% of what she asked for. She had already accounted for that. She had already asked for more than she needed, calibrated to the aircraft she actually had rather than the one she wished she had. The runway surface appeared beneath them. 50 feet, Holloway said. She pulled power back. She initiated the flare. The aircraft responded sluggishly, the hydraulics delivering less than nominal, but enough because she had built the margin into her inputs from the beginning. The main gear touched. Not perfectly. Nothing about tonight was perfect. The left main touched a half second before the right, the crosswind, pushing the aircraft slightly off centerline in the moment between main gear contact and nose wheel contact. And for approximately 1 second and 40 feet of runway, the aircraft was tracking slightly right of centerline. She caught it. Nose wheel down, thrust reversers deployed, the roar of the engines running in reverse, filling the aircraft with sound and vibration. steering input to the left, compensating for the crosswind, feeling the degraded authority in the nose wheel respond at 60% of nominal. The aircraft decelerated. The emergency lights along the runway strobed past in her peripheral vision. The center line passed back beneath them. The aircraft was slowing. 2,000 meters of runway remaining. 1,500, 1,000. The aircraft was walking speed now, and she had 500 meters of runway left, and the emergency vehicles were running alongside in her peripheral vision, their lights painting the rain-soaked tarmac in red and yellow. She brought the aircraft to a stop. She sat there for a moment with her hands on the controls and the engines spooling down around her and the rain hammering the windshield and the emergency lights sliding past as the vehicles positioned around the aircraft. Holly said nothing. For 5 seconds, neither of them said anything. Then Holloway said in a voice that was very quiet and very sincere, "Major Bennett, Sergeant Holloway, that was the best piece of flying I have ever seen in my life." She looked at the instruments. She looked at the hydraulic pressure gauge, which was now at 28% below nominal, and falling further as the system continued to lose fluid on the ground. She said it needed to be. She began the shutdown checklist. The crew chief on the ground was already at the nose, visible through the rain-blurred windshield, guiding the aircraft toward its parking position with the same practiced hand signals that ground crews use everywhere. The universal language of the flight line that exists independent of weather and conditions, and how difficult the last 2 hours have been. She followed his signals. She parked the aircraft. She shut down the engines in sequence, listening to each one wind down, hearing the specific quality of their silence after so much noise. Then the crew door opened, and the cold hit her again, the same cold that had hit her when she walked across the flight line an hour and a half ago. The same indifferent Afghan mountain cold that didn't know or care what she had done in the intervening time. She climbed down. The ground was wet. There were people around the aircraft, the emergency crew, the ground crew, a handful of others who had apparently gathered because word travels fast on a small base when something significant has happened. Claire stood at the base of the ladder and looked at the aircraft for a moment. It was still standing. That mattered. She turned toward the command center building. She needed to file a report. She needed to manage the conversation with Hargrove, which was going to happen whether she wanted it to or not, and which she might as well approach on her terms rather than his. She needed to drink something hot and sit down for a few minutes because her hands were starting to shake slightly, now not from fear but from the specific physical aftermath of 2 hours of sustained precision, flying in high-stress conditions, the body doing the thing it always does when the adrenaline finally processes. She had taken approximately 12 steps toward the command center when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. It was Cole. He was standing in the rain without a jacket, which told her he had come out quickly, which told her he had been watching for her to land. He was holding nothing. He looked at her with an expression that she could not fully read because there were too many things in it, relief and gratitude, and something else, something that was less easy to name. "Major Bennett," he said. "Captain Cole," she said. He stopped in front of her. They stood in the rain. 11 people, he has said. Torres comes home. Brennan is in surgery right now. 11 people are going to be alive tomorrow because of what you did tonight. She looked at him steadily. "I know," she said, not arrogantly, just factually. She did know. That was part of why she had stood up in the first place. "I owe you," he started. "You don't," she said. "It's not a transaction." He stopped. He looked at her for a moment. "Why did you stand up?" he asked. And it was a genuine question, not rhetorical, not the setup for a speech. He actually wanted to know. Claire thought about the answer for a moment. She thought about what she could say that was actually true rather than what sounded good. "Because nobody else was going to," she said, "and I knew how." Cole let that sit for a moment. "Hargrove is going to be a problem," he said. "I know. He didn't authorize the mission. You flew it anyway. In the Air Force, that's my problem," she said. "Not yours. You asked if anyone could fly. You didn't order me. I volunteered. The consequences belong to me." Cole shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "They don't. I asked the question. I made the call. I'll stand in front of whoever I need to stand in front of." She looked at him. There was something in his expression that she recognized because she had worn it herself, the expression of someone who has been changed slightly but permanently by something that happened in the last few hours. The kind of change that doesn't announce itself and doesn't feel dramatic, but that you know is real. Because something that was there before is not there anymore, replaced by something different that will not go away. You've been in this business a long time, she said. How often does it actually turn out okay? Cole thought about that. Less often than you'd want, he said. More often than you'd expect. She almost smiled. Not quite. I need coffee, she said. I have cold coffee in the command center. That's fine, she said. They walked toward the building. And it was there in the space between the parked aircraft and the command center door in the rain 12 steps across wet tarmac that the thing happened that neither of them had anticipated. The door opened. Hargrove was standing in it. Hay was in full uniform, which meant he had not been to sleep, which meant he had been in that building for the last 2 hours watching the mission unfold on screens and radios. His face was carrying the specific expression of a senior officer who is managing a significant number of conflicting emotions and is doing it very badly. He looked at Cole, he looked at Claire. He said, Captain Cole, Major Bennett, my office, now. The command center behind him was not empty. The watch team was there. Vasquez was there. Prescott was there, standing near the back of the room and looking like a person who very much wished he were somewhere else. They all heard it. Cole said, Sir Major Bennett just completed a combat flight in a degraded aircraft in instrument conditions. She needs my office, Hargrove said again, both of you. His voice was flat and hard and carried the full weight of his rank and his authority and his very specific anger. And Claire knew that anger was not simple. She had encountered senior officer anger before. She had learned to read it. Hargrove's anger was not entirely about insubordination and unauthorized mission execution. Part of it was something that people rarely admitted out loud. Part of it was that they had been right and he had been wrong, and people were alive because of it. And that was sometimes the hardest thing for a certain kind of senior officer to manage. She followed Cole through the door. She followed Cole into the building. And behind her, the rain kept falling on the flight line, and the aircraft sat where she had parked it. And somewhere to the south, an extraction helicopter carrying 11 people and the body of Sergeant First Class Torres was crossing out of the mountains and into the gentler air of the southern lowlands. They were all going home. Every one of them. Hargrove's office was at the back of the command center. The door was solid wood and incongruous detail in a building that was otherwise entirely functional and military, a door that looked like it had been salvaged from somewhere else and installed here without anyone asking why a combat forward base needed a solid wood office door. Cole held it open. Claire walked through. Hargrove closed it behind them. The three of them stood in the room. Hargrove sat down behind the desk. He looked at them for a long moment. I want to be very clear about what happened tonight, he began. Sir, Cole started. Captain Cole. Hargrove's voice had changed. Something had left it. The flatness was still there, but the hardness had shifted, become something different, something more complicated. I am speaking. Cole was quiet. Hargrove looked at Claire. He studied her face for a moment with the expression of someone who is revising an earlier assessment and is not entirely comfortable with the revision. You flew an unauthorized combat mission in a degraded aircraft, he said, in conditions I assessed as prohibitive. Yes, sir, she said. You did so after I had already made a command decision to discontinue the mission. Yes, sir. 11 people are alive right now. Yes, sir. He was quiet. He was quiet for a very long time. The rain hit the window behind him. Outside, somewhere on the flight line, one of the emergency vehicles was running its engine, and the sound of it came through the walls of the building, with a low, constant rumble that was almost like a heartbeat. Hargrove said, What do you need right now, Major? It was not the question anyone in that room had expected. Claire blinked, just once. Then she said, A chair and coffee, sir. Hargrove looked at the watch officer through the glass partition. Get Major Bennett a chair and coffee, he said, and then almost to himself, in a voice that was quieter than anything he had said in the last 2 hours. And get me one too. Cole looked at Claire. Claire looked at the door. And somewhere in the equation of everything that had happened tonight, the unauthorized mission and the degraded aircraft and the mortar team and the Eastern Ground Unit and the crosswind landing and Hargrove's anger and the rain and the cold and the 11 people heading south right now in an aircraft that had made it to them because one woman stood up in a corner and said yes. Somewhere in all of that, something had resolved. Not everything, not cleanly, but something real. something that the next morning would begin to answer for in the specific bureaucratic paper filing way that military institutions manage their human drama, and that would require Claire to write a report, and Cole to write a report, and Hargrove to write a report, and all three of those reports would be reviewed by people who were not in this room tonight and who had access to the outcome, but not to the 2 hours that produced it. But right now, in this moment, none of that had started yet. Right now, there was a chair being brought into a room. Right now, there was cold coffee. Right now, somewhere to the south, Torres was going home, and Brennan was in surgery, and Kirby was probably sitting in the back of an extraction helicopter, pressing his hands flat against his thighs, the way people do when the adrenaline is still in their blood, and the enormity of what almost happened is starting to arrive. And right now, in a corner of a forward operating base in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, a woman sat down in a chair she had been offered by the man who had told her earlier that evening not to fly. She drank the coffee. It was as advertised cold. She drank it anyway. The cold coffee was gone in 4 minutes. Claire set the empty cup down on the edge of Hargrove's desk and looked at her hands. They had stopped shaking somewhere between the second and third sip, which was about what she expected. The shaking was never from fear, not during anyway. It was always after. The body saving its honest response for the moment when the work was done, when there was finally enough safety in the environment to afford the luxury of falling apart slightly. She didn't fall apart. She just noticed the shaking noted when it stopped and moved on. Hargrove had not said anything significant since he asked for the coffee. He had made 2 phone calls from the desk, short, quiet, the kind where you mostly listen and say yes and then hang up. And he had looked at papers on his desk that may or may not have actually required his attention. It was the behavior of a man who was doing things to avoid doing the one thing that needed to be done, which was to sit in a room with the 2 people who had directly contradicted his command decision and figure out what that meant. Cole had taken the other chair. He was sitting with his elbows on his knees looking at the floor, not in defeat, but in the specific posture of a man who is very tired and is conserving energy for whatever comes next. The watch officer knocked once and opened the door. "Sir," he said to Hargrove, "the extraction aircraft has landed at Bagram. Shadow Team 9 is on the ground. All personnel accounted for." Hargrove looked at him. "And Torres," he said, "transferred to the Mortuary Affairs Unit, sir." Hargrove nodded once. The watch officer closed the door. The rain kept hitting the window. Hargrove put both hands flat on the desk in front of him. He looked at them for a moment. Then he looked at Cole. "You made a unilateral decision to authorize a combat mission that I had explicitly declined," he said. "Yes, sir," Cole said. He did not offer anything else. "You put Major Bennett in an aircraft with a known mechanical deficiency and sent her into a combat environment." "Major Bennett volunteered," Cole said. "She understood the mechanical situation. She made her own assessment." Hargrove's eyes moved to Claire. "Is that accurate, Major?" "Yes, sir," she said. "You understood the hydraulic situation before you departed?" "Yes, sir." "And you assessed it as manageable?" "Yes, sir, and I was correct." It was a simple statement, not defiant, not triumphant, just accurate. She had assessed it as manageable. It had proven to be manageable. Those 2 things were connected. Hargrove studied her. "You were also flying without current theater clearance," he said. "You were a transiting officer waiting for a flight home. You were not attached to this unit. You were not in the duty roster. You had no formal authority to be in that aircraft." "That's all correct, sir." "Which means," Hargrove said slowly, "that from a regulatory standpoint, you exposed yourself to significant professional risk by executing this mission." Claire said nothing because she had known that before she stood up. That was the part that nobody in that original room had seen on her face, not the calculation about the aircraft or the weather or the enemy positions, but the prior calculation. The one she had done in the 3 seconds before she pushed her chair back. The one that went, "If this goes wrong, it ends your career. If this goes right, it might still end your career. You are going to do it anyway." Are you sure she had been sure? She was still sure. "Sir," Cole said, "I want to be on record as the authorizing officer for this mission. Whatever regulatory exposure exists, it belongs to me." I asked the question. I accepted her answer. I sent her out. Hargrove looked at it. Something moved in Hargrove's face that was not quite an expression, more like the ghost of one. The trace of something that had passed through and left a mark. You'd take that on, Hargrove said. Not a question. Yes, sir. Even knowing what it could mean for your record. 11 people are at Bagram right now because of what happened tonight, Cole said. That's the only record that matters to me. Hargrove stood up. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to both of them, looking at the rain on the glass, and neither Cole nor Claire said anything, because sometimes the most important things happen in silence, in the space between what people say out loud and what they are actually deciding. He stood there for a long time. Then he said without turning around, I made the wrong call. Cole and Claire both went very still. I looked at the weather report and the mechanical assessment and the timeline, and I made a decision that was professionally defensible and tactically wrong. He paused. 12 men in that valley, 12 people with families. Another pause. One didn't make it home, but 11 did, because 2 people in this room did something I told them not to do. He turned around. His face was not soft. It was not the face of a man in the middle of a sentimental moment. It was the face of a man who has been in this business long enough to know the difference between a decision that feels correct and a decision that is correct, and who is currently reckoning with the distance between the two. I am going to recommend both of you for formal recognition, he said. I am also going to document the mechanical irregularity and the weather conditions and the timeline in a way that reflects the reality of what you faced. And I am going to note in the operational record that the mission was executed under exigent circumstances with my retroactive authorization. Cole looked up. Claire looked at Hargrove. Retroactive authorization, sir, Cole said carefully. The mission succeeded, Hargrove said. The personnel were recovered. The aircraft is on the ground. And I am the senior officer at this installation, which means the outcome of this mission belongs to this installation, and I am not going to allow a technicality about who authorized what at what time to become the story that follows 2 officers who just did something extraordinary. He paused. That is my decision, as the commander. Are we clear? Cole said. Yes, sir. Claire said, yes, sir. Hargrove looked at her. Major Bennett, he said, where were you headed before the weather held you here? Fort Bragg, sir. I was rotating home. How long have you been in theater? 8 months, he nodded. Get some sleep, he said. Both of you. We'll debrief in full at 0800. He picked up his radio. He was already dialing. Cole and Claire walked out of his office and back into the command center. In the room, the watch team, Vasquez of Prescott, the liaison officer, the satellite communications contractors, was very carefully pretending that everyone in it had been too busy with their work to hear anything that had just happened on the other side of that solid wood door. Nobody succeeded in the pretense. Vasquez looked at Cole with an expression that asked a dozen questions at once. Cole shook his head slightly, which answered all of them. Prescott looked at Claire. Claire looked back at him. Prescott looked away first. She had expected that. She walked to the back of the room, to the corner. She picked up her jacket from where she had left it, over the back of that chair. The same chair she had been sitting in when Cole asked his question 2 hours and 40 minutes ago, and she sat back down in it. Not because she felt invisible, not because she was hiding, because she was tired and the chair was there, and for the moment, she didn't need to be anywhere else. Holloway appeared in the doorway 15 minutes later. He had been with the maintenance crew going over the aircraft doing the post-flight damage assessment that would determine what had happened to the hydraulic system and when it had started and whether it was foreseeable and preventable or simply the kind of thing that happens to old aircraft that are asked to do hard things. He saw her in the corner. He walked over. He did not sit. He stood in front of her and looked at her with the expression of someone who has spent the last 15 minutes talking about the last 2 hours with maintenance professionals and is still not entirely able to process what the last 2 hours actually were. Hydraulic line, he said, a microfracture in a fitting on the secondary system pre-existing, could have been there for months. Pressure cycling in the cold weather tonight, he opened it up progressively. He paused. Maintenance says if you hadn't been as conservative as you were with the maneuvering, it could have cascaded significantly faster. I know, she said. They want to talk to you about the landing, the rollout data. They said the energy management on that runway with that headwind component in that hydraulic state was, he stopped. Was what Holloway sat down then in the chair next to her that had been empty all night. They want to write it up, he said, as a training example for the simulator program. She looked at him. Not as an accident report, she said. No, ma'am, as a training example. He looked at her steadily. They said they've never seen rollout data that looked like that with those system states. They said whoever flew that approach was either very lucky or very good. What did you tell them? I told them lucky people don't account for 30% hydraulic loss in their flare planning before the hydraulic loss is at 30%. She was quiet. You were watching that, she said. I was watching everything, he said. That's my job. He paused. That's also just what you do when you're next to someone like you. You watch because watching teaches you things. She looked at her hands. They were still again. Holloway, she said, ma'am, you did good work tonight. You kept the system's information coming at exactly the right pace. You didn't overshare and you didn't undershare. You gave me what I needed when I needed it. She looked at him. That's not a small thing. He held her gaze. I left a good cup of coffee in that briefing room, he said. This time she did smile. It was small and tired and completely real. I owe you a worse one, she said. You owe me two now, he said, for the hydraulics. She nodded. Fair, she said. He stood up. Go sleep, Major, he said. You've done enough for one night. He walked out, and she sat there in the corner, in the chair with the command center, humming around her, and the rain still falling outside and the night beginning, almost imperceptibly, to shift toward the specific quality of darkness that comes just before it starts becoming something else. She was almost asleep in the chair when the door opened and Kirby walked in. She didn't know it was Kirby at first because she had never met. Kirby had only heard his voice on the radio, and the person walking through the door right now looked like someone who had been through an experience that aged them somewhere between 5 and 10 years in the last 3 hours. He was still in his kit, dusty and damp, and he moved like a person whose body had been running on chemicals that were now very nearly depleted. He looked around the room. His eyes stopped on Claire. He crossed the room toward her. She had sat up when the door opened the way you do when you have been in a combat environment and your body doesn't fully believe the emergency is over yet. And she was looking at him as he walked toward her with the specific, focused expression of a person trying to identify someone they have never seen but have heard. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her. She looked at him. Raven one, he said. It was the quietest question she had ever heard asked at full volume. Yes, she said. Kirby Sergeant, First Class, Daniel Kirby, 11-year Ranger, 2 Silver Stars, 3 combat deployments. A man who had held his team together in a valley in the dark for 3 hours, while the enemy closed in, sat down on the floor. Not in a chair, on the floor. Cross-legged right there in front of her chair, the way a person sits when their legs have simply made the decision independent of their brain. He sat down and he put his arms on his knees and he looked up at her from the floor and he said, I didn't know who was coming. When you first checked in, I didn't know if you were any good. I just needed someone to show up. I know, she said. And then you showed up and you were, he stopped. He looked at his hands for a moment. When you told us to hold position and you went off to deal with the eastern element, 4 minutes. You told us 4 minutes. He looked up. 3 of my guys were in the open, in the dark, and the sky was empty, and I was counting. I was literally counting. 4 minutes is a very long time to count. I know, she said again. You came back at 3 minutes and 52 seconds, he said. I know because I was counting. She said nothing. Torres, he started. He stopped. He pressed his lips together and looked at the wall behind her for a moment and then looked back at her. Torres was already gone when you arrived, he said. He was gone before anyone knew you were coming. I want you to know that. What happened to Torres that wasn't anything you could have changed? I need you to know that. Something moved in Claire's face. Something that she had been very carefully not allowing to move for the last 3 hours. Thank you, she said. She said it quietly and she meant it completely. He was a good man, Kirby said. He had a daughter, 7 years old. She sends him drawings. Claire was quiet. He'll go home with drawings in his kit, Kirby said. I made sure of that. She nodded. She did not trust her voice for a moment. The command center hummed around them. Someone across the room made a radio call in a low voice. The rain kept falling. Kirby stood up from the floor using the kind of controlled effort that tells you a body is running at very low reserves. He stood in front of her and he looked at her with the expression of someone who is trying to say something they don't have adequate words for. I've had air support on a lot of missions, he said. A lot. I've had pilots who were technically excellent and pilots who were average, and one or two who were maybe the wrong call on the day. But I have never in 11 years had a pilot who I felt with certainty was not going to leave us. She looked up at him. That's what you gave us tonight, he said. Not just the fire support, the certainty. When you got on the radio and said 4 minutes the way you said it, I believed you. My guys believed you. And that belief, he stopped. That belief is worth something I don't have a word for. He extended his hand. She took it. His grip was firm and brief and contained everything he hadn't said. Then he nodded once and walked to find Cole, which was where he had been going before he detoured to find her first. She sat in the chair. She sat in the corner. And the thing that Kirby had said about the certainty about the way you say something, being worth more than what you say, settled into her, the way things settle in when they are true. She had not been certain, not in the way Kirby meant. She had been precise. She had been trained and experienced and committed, and she had built margins into her decisions so that when things went wrong, and things always went wrong, there was room to recover. But the certainty Kirby described was something she had given him deliberately. The same way you carry the fear for people so they don't have to, you carry the uncertainty too. That was the job. It was 8 minutes past 3 in the morning when Cole found her. She was still in the chair, not asleep. The kind of awake that comes after deep exhaustion has passed through and left something quieter on the other side. Cole pulled a chair from the nearest table and set it in front of her and sat down. He had 2 cups of coffee. He held one out. She took it. It was warm. Someone had made a fresh pot. She drank from it and said nothing. Cole drank from his. The silence between them was comfortable in the way that silences between people who have been through something together can be comfortable when everything important has already been said and what's left doesn't require words. After a while, Cole said, "Kirby talked to you." "Yes." "He's going to put you in for something," Cole said, formally. He said he was going to write it up tonight before he sleeps because he wanted the words while they were still accurate. She shook her head slightly. "He doesn't have to." "He knows," Cole said. "He wants to." She looked at the coffee cup. "Hargrove is also moving forward with the recommendation," Cole said. "Whatever happens with the paperwork, and there will be paperwork. It's the Air Force. There's always paperwork. You're going to come out of this with your record intact. More than intact." "That wasn't why I stood up," she said. "I know," Cole said. "That's exactly why it matters." She looked at him. He looked back at her. "Why are you still awake?" she said. "You've been up longer than I have." "Can't sleep," he said. "I keep running the math." "What math?" "If you hadn't been on this base tonight, if your flight had left on time, if Hargrove had been convincing enough that you'd sat back down." She was quiet. "The math doesn't come out the same," he said. "No," she said, "it doesn't. That's what I keep thinking about." He set down the coffee cup. "Not the mission. The mission is what it is. I keep thinking about the version of tonight where you got on that flight and the chair stayed empty, and I asked the question and nobody stood up." She had thought about that version too. Not with guilt. There was no guilt to carry because she hadn't been on that flight and the chair hadn't stayed empty. But the awareness of it, the awareness of how close it had been. Your flight leaves on time. 12 people die. Torres still dies, but not alone. Your flight doesn't leave on time. You sit in a corner, somebody asks. The difference between those 2 versions of tonight was weather, just weather. The indifferent, unpredictable, non-strategic weather that had grounded her flight and held her on this base and deposited her into that specific chair in that specific corner at that specific hour. She had thought about that. "There's a version of this story," she said slowly, "where the lesson is that I was lucky to be in the right place, that it was just circumstances." Cole looked at her. "And the other version," he said. "The other version is that the circumstances don't matter if you're not ready to say yes when the question comes." She looked at the window. Other people were in that room tonight. People with military experience, combat experience. Nobody else stood up. "They couldn't fly the aircraft," Cole said. "No," she said, "but some of them could have done something, offered something, contributed something." The room was full of experienced people, and the room was silent. She paused. "The question isn't just about whether you can do the thing. It's about whether you're willing to offer what you have when it's needed, even if it's not perfect, even if there's risk." Cole was quiet. I was looking at her with an expression she had seen before on people who are hearing something that is simple and true and that they somehow hadn't put into those specific words before. "Where did you learn that?" he said. She thought about it. "From the people I lost," she said. He held her gaze. "Tell me," he said. And this was the moment, the one she had not expected, the one that had not been in any plan or checklist or calculation, where Claire Bennett, who had spent 8 years not talking about the night she lost 2 crew members, found herself in a corner chair at 3 in the morning with a cup of warm coffee and a man who had just watched her save 11 people, and she told him, "Not all of it. You never tell all of it the first time, and maybe you never tell all of it at all." But she told him the shape of it. The night in 2016 when the missile came out of the dark. The names of the 2 people she lost. The 47 minutes of flying home with a damaged aircraft and 2 empty seats, in the specific quality of that silence that she had never been able to describe accurately and stopped trying to describe after a while. She told him what it had done to her. The quietness. The step back from anything that looked like recognition or advancement or visibility. The decision to fly transport. Not because she couldn't fly combat, she clearly could, but because she needed for a while to fly things that weren't pointing at anything. And then slowly the return, the requalification on the gunship, the 8 months in theater. The moment 7 weeks ago over Kandahar when she had run a fire support mission and come home and sat on the flight line and understood that she was ready again. Ready for what she hadn't known at the time. Now she knew. Cole listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Their names." She looked at him. "You said their names," he said, "earlier in the aircraft. You said you still say them." She had not told him that specifically. I had noticed it somehow anyway. "Yes," she said. "Will you?" he said. She looked at him. She said the names. Cole repeated them. Quietly, carefully, with the respect of someone who understands that a name is a real thing, that it points at a real person, that saying it is a small act of insistence on someone's continued existence in the world. She had not expected that. She had not expected a lot of things about tonight. "The debrief is at 0800, she said eventually. "I know. I should try to sleep." "You should," he said, but he didn't move. Neither did she for another minute. Then she said, "Cole, yeah, when you asked if anyone could fly in that room, you didn't really think someone was going to answer." He looked at her. "No," he said. "I asked because not asking was not something I was willing to do. But no, I didn't think someone was going to answer." She nodded slowly. "And then someone answered," she said. "And then someone answered," he said. She stood up. She picked up her jacket. She looked at the corner chair, the one she had sat in all night, the one nobody had noticed her, and the one she had stood up from when the question came. It was just a chair, a folding metal chair with the slightly bent left leg pressed against the wall of a converted storage room on a forward operating base in eastern Afghanistan. She looked at it for a moment. Then she walked toward the door, and before she reached it, she stopped and turned back to Cole, who was still sitting in the chair he had pulled up holding his coffee. "The person in the corner isn't invisible," she said. "They're just waiting for the right question." Cole looked at her. She walked out into the dark. The rain had stopped. The air was cold and clean, the way mountain air gets after a storm, passes through and takes everything with it. The flight line was quiet. The aircraft was parked where she had left it, and in the pale pre-dawn light that was just beginning to separate the sky from the mountains, it looked less scarred than it had before. Or maybe she was just looking at it differently. She walked to her quarters. She had 6 hours before the debrief. She would use 4 of them to sleep and 2 of them to write the clearest, most accurate account she was capable of writing of everything that had happened tonight. Because that account was the last thing she owed to the 11 people in Bagram and to the one person who had gone home a different way. She owed Torres a true account. She would give him one. She opened the door to her quarters. She sat on the edge of the bunk. She said 2 names. Then she lay down. And for the first time in a very long time, sleep came quickly and without argument. She woke up minutes before her alarm. That was how it had always worked for her. The body refusing to be surprised, the internal clock that years of military service had calibrated so precisely that she rarely needed the alarm at all. She lay in the dark for those 4 minutes without moving, doing the thing she always did in the first moments of consciousness after a significant event, which was to let the previous night reassemble itself in her mind in the correct order. The command center, the question, the aircraft, the valley, the mortar team, the eastern element, the defile, The extraction, the landing, Hargrove's office, Kirby on the floor, Cole in the chair at 3 in the morning, Torres. She said the two names she always said. Then she added Torres. She got up. The debrief was at 800 hours, and she had 2 hours of writing to do before it. And she did that writing at the small desk in her quarters, with the kind of focus that comes from having something important to say and knowing exactly how to say it. The report was clear and sequential and did not editorialize and did not soften anything. It described what she had found, what she had assessed, what she had decided, and what the outcomes had been. It was the most accurate document she was capable of producing about the events of the previous night, and when she finished it, she read it through once and changed 2 words, and then it was done. She carried it to the debrief. The debrief room was the same command center rearranged. The tables had been pulled into a single long rectangle. There were printed materials at each seat and water on the table, and a screen at the front showing a timeline overlaid on the satellite imagery of the valley that now, in the flat light of morning, looked completely different from how it had looked at night. Less threatening, more geographic, the kind of thing you could study from a distance without feeling it in your chest. Hargrove was at the head of the table. Cole was to his left. Vasquez was 3 seats down. Holloway was there, which surprised her slightly. Crew chiefs were not always included in officer-level debriefs, but she understood why when she sat down and Hargrove opened with the statement that everyone in this room had contributed to the outcome of the previous night, and everyone in this room had a perspective that the record needed to contain. Prescott was there. I was sitting in the chair farthest from the door, which she noticed because it was the chair farthest from her, and she had the thought that Prescott had spent the last several hours rearranging his understanding of the previous night and was still in the middle of that process. She did not think about Prescott for very long. The debrief began. It ran for 2 hours and 40 minutes and covered every decision point from the initial mission degradation through the extraction, aircraft's landing at Bagram. Hargrove ran it with the specific disciplined thoroughness of a senior officer who has decided that the most useful thing he can do right now is ensure that everything about the previous night is documented with complete accuracy, because complete accuracy is the thing that will be most useful to the people who read this record next year and the year after, and in the simulator programs that Holloway had mentioned. When it was Claire's turn, she walked through her decisions in sequence, and she did not minimize the risks she had taken, and she did not dress them up as anything other than what they were, which were risks that she had assessed as acceptable, given the stakes, and that had proven in the event to be manageable. Nobody interrupted her, not even Prescott. When she finished, Hargrove said, "Are there any questions for Major Bennett?" Vasquez raised his hand. I was the last person she expected to raise his hand. He was looking at her with the direct, unsentimental gaze of someone who has been in this business longer than almost anyone else in the room and who is going to ask the question he actually wants the answer to, rather than the question it is appropriate to ask. "Major," he said, "when you were managing the hydraulic situation on approach, at what point did you know you had it?" She thought about that. "When the main gear touched," she said. Vasquez held her gaze. "Not before, not with certainty," she said. "Before touchdown, I knew the approach was within parameters, and I knew the energy was manageable if the crosswind stayed below 25. But certainty was on the ground." Vasquez nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said. She understood what he was doing. He was asking the question that separated real competence from performed confidence, and the answer she had given was the real answer, not the polished one. The polished answer would have been to say she knew earlier. The true answer was what she said. Vasquez had wanted the true answer. She had given it to him. After the debrief, the room broke into the informal conversations that always follow formal ones, the subgroups forming around tables with coffee, and the accumulated aftermath of a significant event working its way through people in different ways. Cole found her near the door. "Transport flight is rescheduled," he said. 1,400 hours. She looked at him. "Today," she said. "Today," he confirmed. "Weather is clear." She nodded. 4 hours. Cole said, "There's something I want to ask you before you go." She waited. "The corner," he said. "You've been in other rooms like that one. Other situations where you had something to offer and you held it." It was not quite a question, but it was asking something. She thought about how to answer it honestly. Yes, she said, not many, but yes. What made last night different? She thought about that for longer than she had thought about the hydraulic question. The cost, she said finally. When I was sitting in that corner last night, the cost of not standing up was 12 people. That's a number I could see clearly. That's not always true. She paused. In other rooms, the cost is less visible. The cost is a career or a reputation or a relationship or someone's approval. And those costs are real. I don't want to pretend they're not real, but they're less certain than 12 people. Cole was quiet. The corner is easier when the stakes are invisible, she said. Last night, the stakes were on a satellite map with coordinates. Hard to pretend they weren't there. And in the rooms where the stakes are less visible, he said. She looked at him. I don't always get it right, she said. He held her gaze. She appreciated that he didn't try to argue with that. None of us do, he said. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair near the door. Not her corner chair, just a chair near the door. And she put it on, and she was almost out of the room when she heard Prescott's voice. She stopped. She turned. Prescott was standing near the table. He was looking at her with an expression that had cost him something to arrive at, that was visible in the careful way he was holding his own face. Major Bennett, he said. She waited. He started. He stopped. He pressed his lips together in the way of a person who has rehearsed something and is finding that rehearsed things sound wrong when you actually say them. She waited. I made assumptions last night, he said, about what you were and what you could do. I made them fast and I made them without information and I was wrong. He paused. I want you to know that I know I was wrong. She looked at him. She thought about several things she could say. She said noted, not warmly, but without cruelty. Prescott nodded. She walked out. The air outside was clean and cold and nothing like the night before the storm completely gone. The sky doing what Afghan mountain skies do after a storm, which is to become extremely clear and extremely blue in a way that felt almost aggressive after so much darkness. She walked to the flight line. The aircraft was there. Maintenance was already working on it. She could see the hydraulic service unit positioned under the wing, and two technicians working on the fitting that had failed. They moved with the brisk efficiency of people who have a problem they understand, and the tools to fix it, and there was something clarifying about watching that, about the specific solvability of a mechanical problem compared to all the other kinds. Holloway was there. I was standing near the nose watching the maintenance crew work, holding a clipboard and a coffee cup, doing the job that he did, which was to know the aircraft completely and to stay with it until it was whole again. He saw her coming. Major, he said. How bad is it? She said, nodding toward the maintenance activity. Fixable, he said. The fitting is cracked, but the line itself is intact. New fitting pressure test. She'll be ready to fly by this afternoon. He paused. Different crew, probably. Probably, she said. They stood together watching the maintenance crew work. After a moment, Holloway said, I told my wife about last night. She looked at him. Called her this morning, he said, and she's used to the calls. She's got a system for them. She makes coffee and sits at the kitchen table and she listens to everything and she doesn't ask questions until I'm done. He looked at the aircraft. I've told her about a lot of missions. She knows the difference between the ones that are worth calling about and the ones that are just events. And last night, Claire said, I told her I flew with someone I would fly with again into any situation on any day, under any conditions, without hesitation. He looked at her. She said that was the nicest thing I had said about a coworker in 14 years. Something moved in Claire's chest, not quite a laugh, something warmer than that. Your wife sounds like a smart woman, she said. She's smarter than me, he said. Significantly. I keep hoping it's contagious. This time she did laugh. It was a real one, short and quiet and entirely genuine. The kind that comes up without warning and surprises you because you didn't know it was there. Holloway smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile fully without any reservation in it. Go home, Major, he said. You've done enough here. She extended her hand. He took it. Thank you, Holloway, she said, for trusting me. He held her hand for a moment. Thank you for being trustworthy, he said. She walked back. She walked back through the base, past the motor pool, past the medical station, where through the window she could see activity that might have been related to post-mission medical processing, past the communications building, past the small concrete structure that someone had painted with the unit insignia of every element that had been stationed here in the last 6 years. Layers of paint accumulating like sediment, the history of the base written in unit patches and years. She had 4 hours. She used one of them to eat real food, actual breakfast in the dining facility, the first meal she had sat down for since the previous afternoon. She ate alone and she looked at her plate and she thought about nothing specific, which was its own kind of rest. She used another hour to call her sister. Her sister's name was Dana, and she lived in Raleigh, and she had 2 kids under the age of 7, and she worked as an ER nurse. And she had over the years developed the specific phone manner of someone who is capable of having important conversations in stolen minutes between other demands. She answered on the second ring. "You're calling early," Dana said, "which means either something happened or you're coming home." "Both," Claire said. A pause. "Are you okay?" Dana said, and her voice had shifted to the ER register, precise, direct, already moving toward a triage. "Yes," Claire said. "I'm okay. I'm coming home today. I have things to tell you." "Did something happen on the flight?" Dana said. "Not on the flight," Claire said. "Before it." Another pause. "Claire." "I'm okay," she said again. "I promise. I need to tell someone who isn't military about last night. I need to tell someone who will hear it differently." Dana was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll make dinner, the good pasta." "I'll be there by tonight," Claire said. "I know you will," Dana said, "because you just told me you would." That simple, that complete. She hung up and sat with the phone in her hand for a moment, feeling the specific warmth of being known, of having a person in the world who hears, "I'll be there by tonight," as a fact rather than a hope, because they know you well enough to understand the difference between when you're saying something you intend and when you're saying something you wish. The transport flight left at 1400 hours exactly. She was at the manifesto point 30 minutes early with her bag on the ground beside her and her report in her pocket, and the particular quality of readiness that comes not from having everything resolved, but from having done what you came to do. Cole was there. She hadn't expected him. He was not in his kit. He was in a clean uniform, which told her he had taken time to change before coming to the flight line, which told her this was not a spontaneous decision. He had planned to be here. He walked to where she was standing. "Flight's on time," she said. "I heard," he said. They stood there. The transport aircraft was being loaded 30 meters away. The ground crew working with the efficient choreography of people doing a routine thing well. "Hargrove is forwarding the recommendation through theater command," Cole said. "You should hear something in the next few weeks. Probably a commendation medal at minimum, possibly more." "Okay," she said. "And Kirby filed his statement this morning. He called me to tell me. He said he wrote it at 0400 because he wanted the words while they were still accurate." Cole looked at her. "He wrote 4 pages for a 1-page form." She said nothing for a moment. "Torres's daughter," she said. Cole looked at her. 7 years old. She sends drawings." Claire looked at the aircraft. "Somebody needs to make sure she knows what her father did last night. Not just that he's gone. What he did, the whole mission, the way his team fought to bring him home, even after." She paused. "She should know that part." Cole's jaw tightened slightly. "I'll make sure of it," he said. "Personally." She believed him. She had believed him from the moment he refused to stop asking questions in a room full of silence. The ground crew signaled a 5-minute call to boarding. Cole looked at her. "I'm going to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer it honestly." "Okay," she said. "Last night changed things. For the people in that room, for the people in that valley." "For me," he paused. "Did it change anything for you?" She thought about that. She thought about the 8 years since 2016, about the quietness she had chosen in the transport flights she had flown, and the slow return in the Kandahar mission 7 weeks ago, and sitting on the flight line afterward, understanding that she was ready again. Ready for what? She knew now. "It confirmed something," she said. "I wasn't sure if I still had it. Not the flying I always knew I could fly, but the standing up. The being willing to be the person who stands up when the room is quiet." She looked at him. "I wasn't sure if I still had that." "And now," he said. "Now I know I do," she said. Cole nodded. There was a version of this moment where he said something about hoping their paths crossed again, something about the future, something that gave the moment a forward momentum. He didn't say any of that. What he said was good. One word, the right one. She picked up her bag. She shook his hand. She walked toward the aircraft. She was 10 steps away when his voice came after her. Major Bennett, she turned. I was standing there in the flat morning light, and he looked like what he was, a man who had been awake for most of 36 hours, and who had in that time watched the worst and best versions of what people were capable of, and who was standing on a flight line in Afghanistan, watching the person who had given him the best version walk toward a transport flight. The next room, he said, the next time you're in a corner and someone asks, you'll stand up again. It was not a question. She held his gaze. Yes, she said. She turned and walked to the aircraft. She found her seat, put her bag in the overhead compartment, sat down, looked out the window at the mountains, which were extraordinary in the morning light, which was information she filed without particularly engaging with because the mountains had been there all night, doing what mountains do, and she was not inclined to credit them with the beauty of surviving them. The aircraft lifted off. She watched the base shrink below the flight line, the command center building, the outline of the forward operating base pressed into the landscape. She did not feel sentimental about leaving. She felt something else, something that took her a moment to identify because she had not felt it cleanly in a long time. She felt complete. Not finished. She was not finished. She was going home to Fort Bragg, and there would be paperwork and debriefs and assessments, and then the next deployment somewhere and the one after that. She was not finished by any measure. But the specific thing she had come here to understand, the question about herself that she had been carrying for 8 years, the one she had finally started to be able to ask clearly in the last several months, that question had been answered. She was still herself, still the person who could look at a room full of silence and decide that the silence was not acceptable, still the person who could stand up. 3 weeks later, she was in a conference room at Fort Bragg, attending a transition briefing for officers returning from deployment. One of 12 people in the room, sitting as she often did toward the back near the wall. The briefer was going through administrative items, post-deployment medical processing, finance reconciliation, leave accrual, the specific unglamorous bureaucratic machinery of returning from a war zone. Halfway through the briefing, the door opened. A colonel she didn't recognize came in and spoke quietly to the briefer. The briefer nodded and looked up at the room. Major Bennett, he said, can you step out for a moment? She stood. The room looked at her, the way rooms look at people who get called out of briefings briefly without sustained interest, already moving on. She followed the colonel into the hallway. The colonel was holding a folder. Major Bennett, he said, I'm Colonel Walsh, J1. I have a communication from Theater Command. He opened the folder. There's a formal commendation recommendation working its way through the system from the forward operating base in eastern Afghanistan. Your name is on it. The theater commander has added his endorsement. He looked up. There's also a personal communication. Not formal, not part of the official packet. It was forwarded with a request that it be delivered to you directly. He held out an envelope. It was not military stationery. It was a plain white envelope, slightly crumpled at the corner. The way things get when they have traveled a distance. And on the front was her name written in a child's handwriting. Careful large, the letters slightly uneven in the way of a 7-year-old who is trying very hard. She looked at it. She looked at Walsh. It came through Torres's family, Walsh said quietly. His daughter, apparently Sergeant First Class Torres, talked about the aircraft, about the mission. His daughter wanted. Walsh stopped. He cleared his throat. She wanted the pilot to know. Claire took the envelope. She held it carefully. Walsh gave her a moment and then said, I can give you the room across the hall if you need a few minutes. Yes, she said, please. He showed her to it, a small meeting room. Empty fluorescent lights, a table, and 4 chairs. He closed the door quietly behind him. She sat at the table. She looked at the envelope. She opened it. Inside was a drawing. It was done in crayon, the thick, definitive crayon work of a child who has not yet learned to be tentative about color. There was a sky very blue. There were mountains very green. There was an aircraft large and central with 4 engines in a shape that a 7-year-old had clearly worked hard to make accurate, had clearly looked at a picture of and tried to reproduce with the tools available to her. And below the aircraft, in the same careful handwriting as the envelope, were 6 words. 6 words. She read them once. She sat very still for a moment. Then she read them again. The 6 words were, thank you for bringing him home. She sat with that. She sat with the drawing and the 6 words and the crayon sky and the careful aircraft. and the weight of what a 7-year-old had understood about the previous 3 weeks that the adults around her had still been struggling to articulate. Torres had not come home the way anyone would have wanted, but he had come home. His team had refused to leave him. Kirby had refused to leave him. The operators who had carried him across that valley floor had refused to leave him, and Claire had covered every step of the distance. He came home. That was true, and a 7-year-old with a bottle of crayons had understood that this was the thing worth saying. Walsh knocked softly on the door 30 seconds later. She folded the drawing carefully. She put it in the inside pocket of her jacket. She would keep it there. She opened the door. Walsh was waiting. "Ready," he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. She walked back into the briefing room. She found her chair near the back wall, and she sat down, and the briefer continued the administrative items, and the room continued to be a room full of people doing the necessary ordinary work of returning from somewhere that was nothing like ordinary. Nobody in the room knew about the drawing in her pocket. Nobody in the room knew about the valley or the hydraulics or the eastern element or the mortar team or the crosswind landing or Kirby sitting on the floor or Cole at 3 in the morning with cold coffee or the 2 names she had said every night for 8 years plus 1 new name that she had added and would say for the rest of her life. Nobody knew she was the person who had stood up. She was just a major near the back wall listening, present, ready, waiting for the next question. And if it came when it came, she would do what she had always done, what she would always do, what no amount of coroners or silence or rooms full of people who didn't notice her had ever managed to change. She would stand up, because that is what you do when you know how and the moment asks. Not for glory, not for recognition, not for the record or the commendation or the 4 pages Kirby wrote at 4 in the morning, or the drawing from a 7-year-old that she would carry in her pocket until the paper wore soft at the folds. You stand up because someone needs to come home. That is all. That has always been all. And for the people who are willing to stand, it is always enough.